Welcome everyone to Human Anatomy and Physiology. This is a 2-semester course. So this is the beginning of part 1, A&P1. We will start off with an introduction to the human body. As you see in chapter 1, it's an orientation. And then we will progress this semester into studying the integumentary system, the skeletal system, nervous system, muscular system. And so we're going to start now with chapter 1, which is the human body and an orientation to help set the foundation or the baseline of a lot of the terminology. One thing you will find out with A&P is that we use the phrase a lot, structure determines function. And what that means is you can look at the structure of something and just by looking at that structure, figure out what does it do? So always kind of keep that in mind, at least in the back of your mind, when you're asked about what's the purpose of different things. What does it look like? That will give you clues. We divide the courses anatomy and physiology. Years ago, they taught them as separate courses. It's, I think, easier the way we do it now, where we combine them together. Anatomy is looking at the structure, and physiology is looking at the function. How does it work? There's different types of anatomy. Gross anatomy, often called macroscopic anatomy, is where you're looking at things that can be easily seen with the naked eye. You don't have to use a microscope. And one thing you'll find in biology is we love to categorize things and break them down into smaller components and subdivide things. So gross anatomy can be subdivided into things such as regional anatomy, where you're looking at all the structures in not the entire body, but just in a certain region. Or systemic anatomy, where you're looking at just the systems. And then surface anatomy is where you're looking at the structures that are internal just beneath the skin surface. Microscopic anatomy is where you are looking at structures that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. So you're going to have to use a microscope in order to see this. Two subdivisions of this are cytology. Cyto means cell, so this is the study of cells. And histology, histo refers to tissue, so it's the study of tissues. Continuing on, different types of anatomy. There's developmental, where you're looking at the structural changes that occur throughout the lifespan. Obviously, from birth to older age, things change. It happens. And so some people specialize in looking at what are those developmental changes that are normal. If you understand what is normal, and that's what this whole course is about, is studying the way the normal structure, the normal physiology is, then you have to understand that to figure out what's wrong when you have a patient who's sick, where something is then abnormal. Something's functioning differently, or maybe the structure is different. Embryology looks at the developmental changes that occur prior to birth. Pathology is looking at the structural changes that are caused by disease. You can also look at different types of physiology. Usually those will be subdivided by the system that's involved, such as renal physiology is dealing with the kidneys, neurophysiology is dealing with the nervous system. You can also go more detailed and study physiology at the cellular level or even at the molecular level. So as I said, structure determines function, so you really cannot study one without the other. You cannot study physiology without understanding what's the normal anatomy. There is a set series of organization that we refer to as structural organization. So if we start at the smallest level, that would be the chemical level. That deals with the atoms and the molecules. Then you move up to the cellular level. A cell is the smallest, most fundamental basic unit of life. It does contain organelles in terms of the type of cells that comprise the human body. We have a chapter later where we will look specifically at some of these organelles. These are small structures within the cell that have a specific function. You take a group of cells, similar cells, group them together, and you form a tissue. You take at least 2 different tissue types, put them together for a similar function, and you have an organ. You group several organs together, you have a system or an organ system. And then you put several systems together, and you have now the whole organism. The human body is composed of 11 different organ systems. And so this is, in this diagram, is just showing basically how you are starting at the chemical level or molecular level. You build those up to form the cells, build those up to form the tissues. You keep getting larger and larger until you're finally at that organismal level. As I said, the human body does have 11 different systems, as they are noted here. The integumentary, the skeletal, muscular, nervous, all of those will be studied in A&P1. And then the endocrine, cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, urinary, reproductive, and lymphatic will all be studied in A&P2. Just very briefly, so you just have a basic understanding of the systems. The integumentary system, this is the skin. When we study it, you'll see that the skin is considered the largest organ in the body. You do have accessory structures. You'll find when you study the systems, we talk about the organs that are found within that system, but then oftentimes there are accessory structures that help a system. So in this case, it would be things like hair and your nails. The skeletal system helps to protect and support a lot of the organs. It's attachment points for your muscles. The muscular system helps to provide movement. It helps maintain your posture. It's important in helping to produce heat and maintaining your internal body temperature. The nervous system is a communication system. It responds very quickly to a stimulus and has a very quick response, but short-lived. Your endocrine system is another communication system. This is your glands that are secreting all of your hormones. And so the stimulus might take a little bit longer. It's not quite as quick and fast acting to be stimulated. However, the response is longer lasting. Cardiovascular system, this is your heart and your blood vessels. It's a transport system. It transports gases such as carbon dioxide and oxygen, nutrients, and it also transports waste. It transports hormones. Your lymphatic system is involved with your immunity. It helps to bring fluids that have leaked out of the cardiovascular system. It helps return those fluids back to into the circulatory system. But it is also, think of it as surveillance. It has cells that are part of your immune system, as I said, that are able to detect what we call non-self, anything that's not part of you, and attack and try to destroy that. Your respiratory system is dealing with the gas exchange, bringing in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Your digestive system is taking in nutrients, breaking those nutrients down, and then having them absorbed into the body so that the body can use it basically for energy and survival. And then it will get rid of the waste. The urinary system is involved with getting rid of certain waste from the body. It's also very important, and some people don't realize this, but in helping to maintain your water balance, keeping you dehydrated, and also helping to maintain what we call the acid-base balance of the blood. In other words, helping to maintain that the pH is held fairly constant. And then the reproductive systems, the overall primary function is for production of offspring. Whether it's male or female, they also produce some hormones. So you'll notice that some systems kind of overlap. Well, they all do to a certain degree, but some of your organs in one system such as with the reproductive, yes, it's part of the reproductive system, but some components of it may also be involved in the endocrine system because they're secreting hormones. So you do have this overlap. And of course, they all work together for the overall proper functioning of survival of the organism, in this case, humans. So as you can see here on this diagram, it's showing how this interaction takes place, that you have with the respiratory system in the lungs where you have this gas exchange occurring, and then oxygen coming into the lungs is then fed into the blood, which is in the cardiovascular system, which is then going to transfer that oxygen all around to the rest of the body. It's picking up carbon dioxide, which is a waste product from throughout the body, and then going to deposit that in the lungs so you can exhale it. Your digestive system is picking up, as I said, nutrients. Those are being absorbed into the blood. It's going to be filtered in the urinary system, get rid of any toxic waste, etc. And so you have this interaction between the systems that's constantly occurring. What does that mean for you if you're going into healthcare? Is that you have a patient that may have some disability, let's say the respiratory system. There may be a disease, there may be a structural problem, whatever the issue is where it's not functioning properly. And you might say, okay, well, it's just with the respiratory system, but that will eventually, you will see effects on all the other systems as well because of this interconnection between them. What are some of the characteristics of living organisms? There's a list of characteristics or functions that we feel to be classified as a living organism. You must have all of these functions. Maintenance of boundaries, movement, responsiveness, digestion, metabolism, excretion, reproduction, and growth. So when we talk about maintenance of boundaries, we're talking about there's got to be a separation between the internal environment and the external environment. And you can look at this at several different levels. In terms of at the cellular level, there's a plasma membrane or a cell membrane that separates the inside of the cell from outside of the cell. And it will regulate, as we'll see, what can pass across that membrane. Your skin separates your internal environment from the outside environment. It's a protective mechanism. So there is this boundary. Movement. With humans, certainly the muscles allow for movement. It is, once again, a coordinated effect. In the muscular system, you'll find that there are 3 different types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And one thing with muscles is what we call contractility, which also allows for movement at the cellular level. So when you move your arm, you're seeing your arm move, but down at the cellular level, there's also movement. So we can look at these characteristics necessary for life as the whole organism, but we can also look at these characteristics at the cellular level. Responsiveness just means you have the ability to respond and sense changes in the environment. Now, you may sense a change and not do anything, and at other times you may say, well, this isn't so good, let's respond to this. This will often involve the nervous system. Once again, it can be at the cellular level versus the systemic level. If you are sitting in a room and let's say it's winter time and you're nice and comfortable and you go outside and it's 30 degrees outside, you're going to notice that. What do? Hopefully put a jacket on. That's going to be your response to that change in the environment. Digestion, this is the breakdown of food that you've ingested. You break it from very complex nutrients into simple nutrients, which then can be absorbed, because complex, very large, think of very large compounds cannot be easily absorbed. The smaller they are, the easier it can be absorbed, and then it's going to be transported via the blood throughout the body. Metabolism just refers to all of the chemical reactions that are occurring within the body cells. We divide it into 2 different types. Catabolism is the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller, simple ones. And then the reverse of that is anabolism. So an anabolic reaction is where you're taking small molecules and you're connecting together. You're synthesizing or making larger compounds. So think of it as if you're making or synthesizing, it's an anabolic reaction. If you're breaking it down into smaller components, that's a catabolic reaction. Excretion is the process of removing waste products that have formed via digestion and metabolism. And then reproduction, this occurs at both, once again, the cellular and organismal level. The cellular level, you're talking about having one cell going through the process of cell division, forming two new cells. This is necessary for growth. It's necessary for repair of damaged tissues and maintaining the bond. And then the organismal level is for survival of the species. Growth just talks about the increase in size of an organism or a body part. Survival needs. There are things that need to be present in order for the organism to survive. And sometimes people think, oh, okay, if you don't have enough, that can be devastating. But sometimes if you have too much, it can also be devastating. So it needs to be an appropriate amount. And this includes things such as nutrients, oxygen, water, maintaining a normal body temperature, and also maintain appropriate atmospheric pressure. So if we look at the nutrients, simply these are chemical substances. You need them to provide energy for the cell and to help the cell build. What are some of these nutrients? They're going to include things such as carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. Carbohydrates are going to be your primary source for energy. Certainly at a cellular level, if a cell is given a choice, it's always going to use carbohydrates first. Those are sures. Proteins, these are very necessary. They're involved with almost every aspect at the cellular level of anything that's going on. They're involved with helping to build different cell structures. They're involved with cell chemistry. Lipids, which are fats, are involved with structural components of the cell. They're involved with long-term energy storage. Typically speaking, we'll get into this later, but at the cellular level, the cell needs energy. Where does it get that from? Well, the number one choice is going to be carbohydrates. If carbohydrates are not present, then it will go for lipids. If lipids are not present and carbohydrates aren't present, then it will use protein. Vitamins and minerals both will be assisting with some of these chemical reactions that occur at the cell. And just so you know, at any one time, at the cellular level, I keep talking about these chemical reactions. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of reactions occurring at the cellular level at any time. Oxygen is required because when you break down the nutrients to produce this energy, one of the final steps, oxygen is required. If oxygen is not present, you're only going to be able to survive for a few minutes. Water is the most abundant chemical in the body. Water has a lot of unique characteristics which allows things to survive. So from a biological standpoint, when you look at water and some of the chemical properties of it, there's a lot of very unique things with it. It does provide a necessary environment for a lot of the chemical reactions to occur in. A lot of them have to occur in water. It's a fluid base for a lot of secretions and excretions. So a lot of things are dissolved in it. In terms of normal body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius is the normal body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are not familiar with degrees Celsius or centigrade, you need to start familiarizing yourself with it. Just to give you an idea, that's the scale of where water freezes at 0, water boils at 100 degrees. It's part of the metric system. So the human body, normal body temperature is 37. Just to give you a point of reference, most refrigerators would be set about 4 degrees C. And room temperature, of course it varies on your personal likes, but typically ranges anywhere from 20 to 22, usually 23 sometimes, but that'd be starting to get a little warm. But they usually will say like 20 to 22 degrees Celsius is your average room temperature. Below 37 degrees C, what happens is chemical reactions start to slow down, and the cell survival is necessary on these chemical reactions. So if the temperature goes too low, these chemical reactions slow down and can no longer sustain life. And if you have something, remember, if you're talking about at the chemical level and you have a change there, you're going to see that at the cellular level, the cells start to die. If you have a problem at the cellular level, that builds up to the tissue, organ, system, and finally the whole organism. If the temperature goes above 37 degrees C, what happens is initially the chemical reactions speed up. But you go above a certain temperature, and what happens then is the proteins will start to, what we call denature, they lose their structure. And remember, structure determines function. So if you destroy their structure, the proteins can no longer function, which means the chemical reactions cannot take place, which means cell death is going to occur. Atmospheric pressure, why is this so important? Well, we need to have a specific air pressure. This is a huge player in what allows you to breathe. There's differences in pressure, and when you inhale, things want to go from high pressure to low pressure. And when you inhale, what happens is you're decreasing the pressure in the lungs, and so naturally air is going to flow into the lungs. When you exhale, you're actually increasing the pressure in the lungs, forcing the air out. So if this air pressure changes, that's going to affect your ability to breathe. Homeostasis, you will hear this a lot. This is referring to this kind of internal equilibrium in the body. It's maintaining this stable environment regardless of what's going on in the outside environment. And it's kind of like you have this preset, say for temperature, a preset thermostat, and it needs to be maintained. And if the internal body temperature starts to get too high, your body makes adjustments. It's going to trigger your sweat glands to start sweating so that as you sweat, it's carrying some of that heat away. If your body temperature gets too low, it's going to trigger a lot of your muscles to start contracting, and that's when you start shivering, because when you shiver, when muscles are contracting, that generates heat, and that's able to bring the body temperature back up. So by having these different internal controls and monitoring what's going on, everything from temperature to calcium levels to pH and sodium levels, potassium, calcium, nitrogen, everything is monitored internally to help try to maintain this equilibrium or this balance. And certain adjustments will be made, once again, if it gets too high or too low. And it allows you to maintain this internal body temperature despite what's going on in the external environment. As an example, your internal body temperature is going to be maintained at 37 degrees C, or relatively narrow range there. Personally, for me, I have been in a range of environments. The coldest temperature that I have been in was when it was 40 degrees below zero, so minus 40 degrees. And obviously I survived that. Did not stay out too long in it, but I did survive that. The hottest temperature I have been in was 119 degrees. Not pleasant, but obviously survived. So even though I've been in these huge range of temperatures, the internal body temperature was maintained. So there's different types of homeostatic controls. The body, as I said, has to be constantly monitored, and that's one thing we will talk about is how is it monitored to regulate this homeostasis. Now, two big roles will be the nervous system and the endocrine system to help maintain the homeostasis. And variables are different factors that can change. So there can be, as I said, body temperature, maybe your blood sugar, maybe the blood volume changes. So how does the body regulate this? How does it control these variables? Well, there's going to be three different components. There's a receptor, there's a control center, and an effector. So the receptor is going to be monitoring the environment. Think of it as a sensor, and it's going to respond to the stimulus. Whatever that change is, that's going to be the stimulus. So that activates the sensory receptor, who then activates the control center. Control center is think of it kind of like your thermostat. It has determined what point that variable needs to be maintained at, that temperature, that blood sugar level, that blood volume, etc. This is where it needs to be maintained, plus or minus a little bit. So it's getting that input from the receptor. It may not make any changes. Okay, we're within the range, we're okay, we monitor it, but we're not going to do anything right now. Or it may say, yes, we need to have some type of a response. We're getting too far away from the set point, either too high or too low. And so we have to have a response to that. The effector is what receives that information from the control center. So it's your response. So it's either going to reduce the stimulus, which is called a negative feedback, or it's going to enhance that stimulus, which is a positive feedback. Most responses will be negative feedback. So this is just showing in this diagram where, number one, you have a stimulus. So there's some change here. That stimulates your receptor. So the stimulus, this change stimulates the receptor, that sensor. That sends it to the control center, who has to analyze. Okay, we're getting a little too far out of our range from our set point, so we need to do something about it. So it's going to activate or inform the effector. Okay, we need this response, which has a response to get it back into that homeostatic balance. So as I said, negative feedback is the most common one. This is where the response is going to go in the opposite direction to try to reduce that original stimulus. So as I meant, the earlier example I gave a body temperature is an example. If your body temperature is getting too low, then the negative feedback response is to do something to get that temperature increased. If another example is with blood glucose levels. If glucose levels are too high, then you're going to secrete insulin to help break down and reduce the concentration of glucose in the blood. So this is giving the example that I just said of the blood glucose. So it's going to be in the opposite direction. And this, once again, is just giving examples of body temperature, how if you're too cold, it's going to trigger you to shiver to bring the temperature back up. If your body temperature is too hot or is rising too much, then it will trigger you to start sweating to bring the temperature down. So it's the opposite direction. Positive feedback is the reverse. This is where it's going to enhance or exaggerate that initial stimulus. There are a couple of examples where we see this in the human body. Two classic examples are when a woman goes into labor. Oxytocin is a hormone that is produced when a woman goes into labor that starts triggering the labor contractions. And then the other example is with blood clotting. So when you have an injury site to one of your blood vessels, there is a stimulus and of the bleeding, and what happens is you'll have platelets start to stick to the site. They adhere to that injured site where there's a tear in the blood vessel. They will release chemicals which then attract even more platelets to come. So instead of having the reverse, it's going to stimulate even more platelets to come, stick to the site. And basically what it's doing, it's forming a plug to plug up that tear or that hole of the blood vessel. And that will continue until the plug is fully formed and the bleeding has stopped. So instead of, oh, we have bleeding here, instead of you're trying to fill the plug to stop the bleeding, the way to do that is to continue having more platelets come in. With a woman who's in labor, if she produces oxytocin, that triggers the uterus to start contractions. So you have the contraction. Well, instead of stopping it, it continues and the contractions get stronger and stronger and stronger until finally you have birth of the baby. Homeostatic imbalance. When things are not kept in this equilibrium, this balance, you do increase the risk of diseases. We do see this imbalance occurring more with part of the aging process. Sometimes these negative feedback mechanisms can become overwhelming, and then you start to have the opposite positive feedback mechanisms start to take over, and you can end up with different disorders such as heart failure. As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of vocabulary that we will use, and I recommend that you learn it now because it will make it so much easier later on as you continue in your studies with A&P. As we start part of this, one thing is to be familiar with the anatomical position. That's how you will normally see the body in pictures, etc., and we will refer to it in the standard anatomical position. This is with the body standing straight up or erect. The feet are slightly apart, facing forward. The arms are going to be down by the side, palms facing forward, so your thumbs are going to be pointing away from the body. We will use directional terms oftentimes to describe one area or one region or one structure as compared to another area, region, or structure of the body. When we use these directional terms, everything is based on the body being in this anatomical position. And just so you know, when you talk about right or left, it's of the patient, not yours. So keep that in mind. These directional terms are usually in pairs. And you'll notice that sometimes in lecture there's obviously correlations to things that you will be learning in lab at the same time. So these directional terms, once again, body's in anatomical position. And like I said, they're pairs. Superior is when you are moving up towards the head. So you're moving up, basically. Inferior would be when you're moving down towards the feet. You're moving away from the head. So you use these as comparison terms oftentimes. So I could say that your stomach is superior to your knee. I could also say your stomach is inferior to your neck. You'll notice that in parentheses there are other terms that are sometimes used, cranial versus caudal. These tend to be used more in like a general biology or zoology class when you're referring to other types of animals. Usually for humans, we'll be saying superior and inferior. Excuse me. Anterior and posterior. Anterior is towards the front of the body, posterior is towards the back. And then we have the terms medial and lateral intermediate. Medial is if think of drawing a midline right through the center of the body right here, dividing it into equal right and left sides. If you're going towards this midline, it's medial. If you're going away from it, lateral. If it's somewhere in between, it's called intermediate. Proximal and distal are used only on the arms and the legs, which are what we refer to as your appendages. Proximal is closer to that point of origin where it attaches to the trunk of the body, so closer to the shoulder or closer to the hip. Distal is further away from that point of attachment. And so you could say that your elbow is proximal to the wrist, meaning it's closer to the shoulder than the wrist is. You could also say that the wrist is distal to the elbow. Superficial and deep. Superficial means towards the body's surface, and deep means you're going more internal, you're going away from the surface. Some regional terms, we divide the body into two major divisions, axial and appendicular. Axial refers to the head, the neck, and the trunk, and appendicular refers to the limbs, your appendages, your legs and arms. Now, these regional terms refer to different areas, specific areas of the body. Unfortunately, the diagram here is not that great. Some of the lines didn't show up well, but this diagram is in your book as well as in your lab book. You do need to be familiar with these terms from both the anterior and the posterior viewpoints of them. You need to become very familiar with them. If you learn it now, it will make it so much easier when later you go to learn muscles, you go to learn bones, you learn the nerves, you learn the blood vessels, etc. As an example, the thigh area is referred to as the femoral area. Well, the bone that is there is the femur. You have a biceps femoris, which is a muscle that's found in that area. You have the femoral artery and vein in that area. So if you learn these regions, or the brachial region, if you learn that right now, it makes it so much easier. What I recommend that you do, repetition, just studying over and over, is going to help. Now, some people have asked me in the past, what's the best way or study tool to use to learn all of this? If you have the means, and not everyone does, I get that, and if you wish, probably one of the number one things that I have found over the years to help students with learning a lot of the vocabulary, and then as we progress on learning the bones, the muscles, etc., is to get an anatomy coloring book. I know it may sound stupid at first, but there's something about physically coloring in that really helps for the studying. I know that can get expensive. The other thing that you can do is either use the pictures. Sometimes I try to supply pictures through Blackboard or from your lab manual, or even just go to Google Images and print out pictures, such as for this, learning these regional terms. Find a picture where it's unlabeled, but things are marked. And then put it in, print out only one copy of it, slide that into a plastic sleeve that you can buy at, any of the stores. You're all familiar, you've used them for reports where they've got the 3-hole punch so you can put them in a binder, but the plastic sleeve, just slide the paper in there, and then use a marker that you can erase. Use a marker, label it, study it, and then just wipe it clean. Label it again. Wipe it clean, label it again. And that way you're not printing out a whole bunch of copies. You're only printing one copy, but having it in that plastic sleeve, you can use a marker that's washable and just wipe it clean. And then, because the plastic sleeves have the 3-hole punch on them already, put them into a binder and then collect them. And then make your own study guide that way. And that it's something that I've recommended for years, and the feedback is a lot of students have found it very helpful. We can also divide the body into different planes and sections. The three most common planes are the sagittal, the frontal, which is also known as the coronal plane, the transverse, which is also known as the horizontal plane. And then depending on how you cut the body into sections, you're cutting along a certain body plane. So the sagittal plane is going to divide the body into right and left parts. If you go right down the midline, then it's often referred to as a mid-sagittal plane. Parasagittal means you're not on the midline. A frontal or coronal plane is going to divide the body into anterior and posterior parts, or front and back. And then a transverse or horizontal plane is going to divide the body into superior, inferior, or top and bottom. This is what oftentimes people will call a cross section. Sometimes you can have an oblique section, which results in an angle that's not at a 90-degree turn. So this diagram here shows, here is a sagittal, specifically a mid-sagittal because it's right along the midline here. But as you can see, you end up with the right and the left sides. Here is a frontal or coronal plane where you have the front and the back. And then over here is the transverse plane where you have the superior, inferior, top, and bottom. And down here is what these sections would look like on the type of plane that was done, the type of section that was done. Which do you do? It depends on what information you are looking for. Different situations will require different types of views. The body does have several internal cavities, and oftentimes the cavities also have membranes around them. Cavities often are containing organisms, and there's extra protection for them. So there's two main sets of cavities, the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. The dorsal body cavity is protecting your nervous system. It is further divided into two subdivisions, the cranial cavity that has the brain enclosed in it, and then the vertebral cavity that encloses the spinal cord. So in this diagram, the yellow is the dorsal body cavity. So you can see up here, this is the cranial cavity, and then this is the vertebral cavity, which has the spinal cord. As you can see, the nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain, that part of the nervous system obviously is very fragile, and you want extra protection around it. So the cavities, they're surrounded by bone, and that's helping to protect those organs that are in there. And then in the red is the ventral body cavity, which, as a moment you'll see, it is subdivided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is further divided into the abdominal and the pelvic. The thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity, this right here is the diaphragm. From this viewpoint, you can see right here, and that is what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the ventral body cavity does contain a lot of your internal organs. Internal organs are often referred to as your viscera. I know we like to add more vocabulary to confuse you. And like I said, there are those two main subdivisions. The thoracic cavity is further subdivided. It contains two pleural cavities. Each pleural cavity contains your lungs. So pleural refers to lungs. And then the mediastinum contains the pericardial cavity, which the pericardial cavity contains the heart. You have abdominal pelvic cavity, which is below the diaphragm. As I said, it's subdivided then into the abdominal cavity. There's not a real distinct feature between the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. You kind of use your hips as a guide. In the abdominal cavity, it's going to have your stomach, your intestines, your spleen, your liver. In the pelvic cavity, that's going to have like your urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the rectum. So once again, in this picture, from this side view or lateral view, here's a thoracic cavity, abdominal pelvic So here's the abdominal, here's the pelvic, and from this anterior or front view, you can see with the thoracic cavity, here are the two pleural cavities that have the lungs. Here is, collectively, this is the mediastinum, which is going to have things such as your trachea, your esophagus as it moves down, and then also within it is the pericardial cavity, which has the heart. Here's your diaphragm separating. Here's your abdominal cavity. Most of your digestive organs are in here. And then the pelvic cavity, which does have your bladder, urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the rectum. Not as much protection in terms of encased with bone around the abdominal pelvic cavities. So if you have severe trauma or injury, a blow to this area, you have a greater risk of damaging some of these internal organs versus even in the thoracic cavity, you've got the ribs surrounding the vertebrae on the back, so there's more protection up here than down here. You want to be able to protect the heart, protect the brain. The pelvic bones do give your hip to some of that pelvic cavity, but as I said, the abdominal organs are going to be a little more susceptible to any type of trauma. The ventral body cavity, the membranes, it's called the serosa or the serous membrane. It's very thin, double layer membrane that's going to surround that ventral body cavity. The parietal serosa lines the internal body cavity walls, whereas the visceral serosa covers the internal organs, which once again are referred to as your viscera. There is a fluid that is between those two layers that helps to reduce friction. And the ventral body cavity, once again, pericardium contains the heart, pleural contains the lungs. Peritoneum is also what is referred to as the abdominal pelvic cavity area. So this is just showing the membranes, the pericardial membranes that are surrounding the heart. If those membranes become inflamed, which sometimes happens if you have, say, an infection, they can start sticking together, and you're going to feel it. Because in the example of the pleural membranes, which surround the lungs, if they become inflamed every time you inhale and exhale, any movement like that, you're going to feel it's going to hurt. That's what pleurisy is. With your abdominal pelvic area, we divide it into quadrants and regions. Quadrants are typically used by the medical personnel. For once, we do make these names very nice. They're logical, so enjoy it. You have the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. And remember, right and left are the patient's, not yours. And so it's just a way of narrowing down. Say you have a patient who comes in and says, well, I have a pain in this area. Well, you can write down that the pain seems to be localized in the right upper quadrant and put that in the notes, because you may not be physically talking to the next healthcare provider who sees that patient, but this way you write it in the notes and everybody knows, okay, the pain is not down here, it's up in this area. Now, we can also go even more detailed from those quadrants and divide it into 9 different regions. And these regions will be, once again, right and left refers to what the patient is. So there's the right hypochondriac region, epigastric region, left hypochondriac region. And then there's below that will be a right lumbar region, umbilical region, left lumbar region. And then below that will be the right iliac or iguanal region, hypogastric region, and the left iliac or iguanal region. So it's often described as like a tic-tac-toe grid. So you've taken the quadrant and now you divide it into smaller regions here. this can further narrow down. Say somebody is going, okay, it's in the right hypochondriac area. You might want to start thinking about, is it a gallbladder issue? It wouldn't be the appendix because the appendix is way down here. So it kind of helps you to narrow down possibilities of what is going on with your patient. Now, there are additional body cavities. In addition to what we've already talked about, there's some other smaller cavities. Some of these are exposed to the environment, such as the oral cavity, which is your mouth, digestive cavities, your nasal cavity, orbital cavities, where your eyes are, and the middle ear cavities. We tend to study those more in detail when we are studying that particular system. So the nasal cavity and digestive cavities we'll study with respiratory and digestive systems in A&P2. The nasal cavity we will look at some at the very end of A&P1 when we study the special senses, so for smelling. The oral cavity we'll look at both for digestion but also for taste. The orbital cavity with the eyes for vision. And the middle ear cavities we'll look at when we study hearing. There are some cavities that are not exposed to the environment. We will study these when we look at joints. Those will be your synovial cavities. So those are the joint cavities.